Well, it's a real honor to have Simon Hill on the podcast today. And he is plugging in all the way from Indonesia today just to be with us and talk about nutrition for women over 50 and how it relates to some of our issues of concern like osteoporosis and sarcopenia. We will cover some of the risk factors and how we can use food, meal timing, fasting, and other techniques to combat some of these problems, as well as what we can do to increase our chances of living a long health span. Now, Simon is the host and founder of the hugely popular The Proof podcast and blog, which I love. And he has really intelligent conversations with guests I know you will absolutely adore. So, Simon is both a nutritionist and a physiotherapist. And he has also spent a lifetime deciphering scientific studies so he can break down how to fuel our body to promote longevity and lower our risk of developing diseases. And he is the plant-based food contributor to Chris Hemsworth's fitness app Center. And in 2019, Simon opened a plant-based restaurant, Eden, in his Sydney neighborhood of Bondi, which I hope to visit sometime soon. And in 2021, just last year, he published his book, The Proof is in the Plants, which shot to the #1 nonfiction book Australia wide in its debut week. So that's something you have to check out too. And Simon has been around. He has a huge following of over 300,000 faithful followers on Instagram. I love his feed and learn so much from him. So now, without further ado, meet Simon Hill. Welcome.
Zora, thank you so much for that. Quite the introduction. Not used to hearing someone talk for so long about myself, but great to be here. And all of those topics that you mentioned at the start, it excites me to be able to talk about those things. I think healthy aging, particularly women's health. Some of these topics don't get as much airtime as they probably should. So looking forward to drawing from my expertise and experience, and hopefully being able to add some value and leave the listeners with some tips and things that they can think about implementing at home in their own lifestyle that hopefully improves their health.
Thank you. And if nobody's noticed yet so far, you have like the perfect podcast voice. And they will really enjoy your podcast, and not only for the content, but just your beautiful, calm voice. And I would love to talk about this topic because I think so glad that you recognize that it is not talked about enough. The population is aging. I'm a gerontologist since we study population aging, and we know that there's just going to be a whole lot more people on the planet who need this information. So we're going to jump right into it. And you're a nutritionist and a physiotherapist at the same time. I love these two together. So we got a really good grasp on the human body and how to train it, how to fuel it. So tell us a little bit about your background quickly before, about your
Sure.
journey and how you've merged those two areas, because not enough people actually do that.
Right. My journey, I guess, really started when I was a very young child or kid. As far back as I can remember, I would recall my dad reading scientific papers in the living room, and he'd print out all these papers, and I'd see little bits highlighted, and there'd be piles and piles of these things, and jump in the car after school to get picked up, and I'd have to shift them off the seat just to get in, and walk into the kitchen, and he'd turn the kitchen into his office. And so science was something that I was around from a young age. My dad's a professor, um, uh, professor of physiology, and has researched for about 40, nearly 45 years, uh, looking at how our arteries function and looking at risk factors for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And he's been involved in very sort of deep science, like imagine under a microscope, looking at mechanisms that level. And I used to spend a lot of time on the weekends with him and put on his white coat and play around with the microscopes when I was a little kid. And so I always had this appreciation for science and fascination with it. And, I saw it as this tool that could help us sort of test our intuition. We come up with these hypotheses about the way that the world works or something works, and we can use a scientific method to determine, are we on the right track, or do we need to look at this in another way? And then through high school, I was playing a lot of sport, a lot of football. Um, really enjoyed that kind of environment, really the camaraderie side of things. And I realized I wanted to pursue science, but I also really wanted to stay within the kind of realm of sport. And so I did physiotherapy as my undergraduate degree. I think in America it's called physical therapy.
Mhm.
Very similar type of university course. That was a 4-year course where you learn a lot about human physiology and biology, but a lot a lot of focus on anatomy and biomechanics and how the body moves, how it recovers, rehabilitation. Not just for athletes. I did a lot of rotations working with elderly, for example, in hospital after a hip fracture, and
Yeah.
you get a real appreciation for how something like a hip fracture can really affect someone's quality of life. And perhaps that'll be something that we talk about um, later in this conversation, because it's something that we can before that we can do quite a lot to try and reduce our risk of that happening. um, but I sort of had this exposure to a whole lot of different types of patients, and graduated and was very lucky to get a job working with professional footballers in Australia. And so I went in full time and was doing that. And at that time, it was dealing with a lot of injured players and trying to help them recover, and then focus on biomechanics and um, trying to optimize their function so they could return to sport. I then realized that I'd always had this real, I guess, passion or interest in food, but I only had a very surface level kind of understanding of it. Very much influenced by fitness culture, which in fact was, to be honest, was kind of what I observed in an elite professional football environment. It was a very one size fits all. Other than say macronutrients and a real emphasis on protein, there didn't seem to be a lot of what I would call sort of evidence based or very specific nutrition protocols for players, and that intrigued me. um, I ended up going back to university and did a master's in nutrition science, and um, with the intent being that I really wanted to focus on the research side of things. So nutrition science is a very different field to physiotherapy. I wanted to understand how do we actually go about making sense of the literature, because as a layperson at that point in time, I was exposed to the same thing that all of us are exposed to when you walk into the bookstore or you see the news headlines. And quite frankly, it feels like no one has any real idea. And um, you know, if if you'd be forgiven for just thinking that we do have no idea, and just throw your hands up and sort of just keep doing what you know, because there seems to be so many contrasting ideas out there. um, so I wanted to actually understand, or go and get the skill to be able to read the literature myself, and then try and decipher what it says, and be able to use that to better assist people that I was working with, be it athletes, but also myself. So I went down that path and developed a sort of healthy obsession, or that's what I would call it, of getting into the literature and exploring the nuance that exists in there. And then a natural progression of that was communicating. I've always enjoyed the communication side of things, and I think that goes back to my early experience with science. My dad was always very big on, he would just always throw questions at me and
Mm.
get me thinking. And he was always, very big on being objective and communicating nuance. And, very rarely things are black and white. And so that can be uncomfortable, and I think that's why we do see a lot of black and white things in the media and on social media, um, because it can offer a degree of comfort. Just when something is sort of boiled down or reduced to a very simple answer. But in fact, things are often a lot more complex and nuanced. And I actually don't find that uncomfortable. I find it interesting. And so my job now is to kind of try and explore that, explain the nuance, but then give people some, specific protocols and things that they can walk away with.
Hmm. So that just makes perfect sense. I can see how this all comes together. And I, it is really hard to boil down the science. And this is why I love your podcast so much, because you do break it down in such digestible terms, but yet give, enough enough guidance, I guess, for us to make our own choice. And I really appreciate the way you do that. You do it so eloquently. And I think this is really, I think the crux of the problem, I think, in our society is that we do take the science and then we just break it down to a black and white. Yes, we should all be doing this, or no, we should all not be doing this. And that's where the confusion comes.
Mhm.
And, in my health coaching days, I'd have, people come to me and say, well, I should be eating this or doing that because this study says that. And then I
Mm.
would look at the study and say, well, these are 50-year-old Finnish men and you're a
Right.
38-year-old Asian girl. I
Mm.
don't know, will it work?
Mhm.
I don't know. I mean, you could try, but
Right.
don't put all your faith into this. And this is where I really think this is where we need to have people like you exactly to break this down, but and give us options and for people to really take responsibility of their own health and say, look, it's so, we all have to find our own path, our own way. We're all bio individual. This is what the biohacking world is all about as well, is you're the N of one. The most important person in the room is you. So that's where we got to get the, boil down to how to help ourselves. But I would love to talk a little bit more about the osteopenia,
Mm.
osteoporosis. Let's, figure out, what does the science say about this? What are the differences? And why does a woman over 50 need to be concerned about it?
Mhm. Yeah, this is really important. And you mentioned earlier that we do have an aging population. Birth rates are slowing down, and we're living longer, um, generally anyway. And so that over 65 age group in particular is growing. It's expanding, and I guess one of the sort of or a positive outcome of that is there is more attention and research now going into looking at menopause, looking at osteoporosis, looking at sarcopenia, and so we're learning more and more. And just to quickly make note of something that you just said, you said I don't know, um, and I think that those words in and of themselves, I often say to people, because people ask me, when you're looking for someone, to determine whether you can trust someone online, I personally love when someone says I don't know.
Mm.
And like you said, for example, you mentioned that you we can reduce things to black and white answers, and then you look at the study and it's in men, it's not in women. And um you know another perfect example of that is fasting, and a lot of the literature again being on males. But so that's just a side note. I think I don't know is sometimes a very good sign, even though it can come across potentially as a weakness. Someone
Mm.
might misconstrue that and think, oh, this person's not that well read. In many cases, for me, that's a good sign that that person is actually probably very well read in the subject and is just being very objective with how they're explaining things.
Mm.
Um, to osteoporosis, the specifics, why it kind of matters. I think it's 1 in 3 women will sustain a hip fracture in their lifetime. That's a pretty big statistic, right?
That's very big.
So,
Yeah.
a bunch of people listening, they probably have a couple close girlfriends. So between the three of you, one of you will have a hip fracture, and for men, it's 1 in 12.
Mm.
There are some differences, both genetic but also hormonal differences, which probably explain that.
Mhm.
Um, Majority of these hip fractures are occurring in people that are 65 and older, right? But what we do earlier in life really impacts that, which I'm sure we'll come to. So, um, what's perhaps more startling? So, one in three women will sustain a hip fracture in their lifetime, but the mortality rate, right? How this is actually affecting people in terms of premature death, I find this to be just mind blowing. So it can depend on which cohort you look at, but a Finnish study comes to mind that looked at hundreds, if not thousands, I believe, of patients who were over 65 that had a hip fracture. And what they were interested in looking at was what's the percentage within the first year, the percentage of people who have a hip fracture over 65 that die. And they found that in that first 12-month period after a hip fracture, it's about 30% of patients who die in that year. So we'll
Mhm.
go back to that first stat, one in three women will sustain a hip fracture, and then can be cohort dependent. But generally, this is a pretty good average. About 30% of those that have that hip fracture will die, sadly, die in the first 12 months.
It's staggering. Staggering
Now,
statistics.
and if you draw that out a little bit further and say, well, what's the survival rate after a hip fracture? Say 48 months, 4 years after. Now you see 80%. So 4 out of the 5 that had the hip fracture have died. So these fractures have an enormous toll. And that's not even speaking to the morbidity. So those that survive, what's their quality of life like? How independent are they? Or now how dependent are they on others because of loss of mobility, or even, often even not assessed in studies, but qualitative things like loss of confidence,
Mhm.
right? So um, hip fractures, and in particular, and in women, this is one of the main reasons that we are concerned about osteoporosis and osteopenia. And it's
Mhm.
if not the main reason why we want to get onto the front foot, understand what is increasing our risk of low bone mineral density, and which of those are sort of modifiable, which are not modifiable. Okay, the ones that aren't modifiable, we're sort of stuck with them, our gender and our genetics. But the ones that are modifiable, what can we do about it? And we can do a lot. Um, to answer your question about difference between osteopenia and osteoporosis, so just quickly, I think many people will be familiar with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes.
Mhm.
And this really speaks to, I guess, metabolic health, or your ability to regulate blood glucose is a spectrum. So you can have, on the far left-hand side, you have someone who has very healthy blood glucose control. And if you were to look at that and measure something like HbA1c, it would be in the healthy range. And if you just move a little bit along the spectrum, and then you say, okay, what about someone who has, you know, slightly worse blood glucose control, but they haven't yet developed type 2 diabetes? Well, if they're over a certain HbA1c, they can be diagnosed with what's called pre-diabetes. So their blood glucose control is not what we would say is that of a metabolically healthy person, but they haven't yet got type 2 diabetes. But they could progress. Not everyone, but they are at higher risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes if you didn't intervene. So it becomes a spectrum. Um, and osteoporosis is very similar to that. It's a metabolic disease of the bone. And we would assess this spectrum by looking at a T score or a Z score. Um, I think the T score is usually referred to more often. You would get this T score by doing a sort of a DEXA scan that looks at your bone mineral density. And the T score looks at how do you compare to the average 30-year-old bone mineral density. And it scores you in terms of standard deviations from that point. So with a sort of, I don't want to get too technical here, but 0 is essentially in the normal range, and -1 and -2 is considered osteopenia. So at that stage, if someone is, say, -1, their bone mineral density is about 10 to 12% lower than the average 30-year-old.
Mhm.
And at -2, it's about 20% lower. And at -2.5, it's about 25% lower than the average 30-year-old. And when you get to -2.5 on a T score, now you're considered to have osteoporosis. So again, it's a spectrum of declining bone mineral density.
Mm.
Um, so normal bone mineral density, osteopenia, osteoporosis. And the difference in terms of, um, I guess, function or outcomes between osteopenia and osteoporosis is that osteopenia is a loss of bone mineral density, but you don't see this increase fracture. Whereas with osteoporosis, progressive further loss of bone mineral density and very soft bone that fractures very, very easily.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of, I guess, how you would differentiate between osteopenia and osteoporosis. And as I was talking about at the beginning, there are a lot of modifiable risk factors. So
Mhm.
things within our lifestyle that increase our risk of going from normal to osteopenia and osteopenia to osteoporosis. And those are the things that really deserve our attention. So we can do a bit of an audit on our own lifestyle and see where we could potentially make some improvement.
Wow, you just did such a great great explanation and answer to my question, very direct, and I am so glad you talked about hip fractures. We, in my master's of gerontology program, covered a, a whole session on falls and fall prevention. I remember going into this going, why are we talking about falls so much? Like, what's the big deal? You fall, you get up.
Mhm.
And it's exactly, we were told what exactly how you explained it, that it is a very serious problem. We can have the hip fractures, especially the women are much more at risk, and it spirals out of control. And I didn't realize, I was shocked when I heard those numbers of mortality, and not to mention the morbidity after a fall and a fracture. And it's quite scary. I even heard, I mean, we had some studies presented to us within 6 months of people. I don't remember if it was 30% or what, but it was pretty high. I was like, wow, even within 6 months, people are dying from either infection from an operation or just spiraling out of control into depression, and then, having a lot of other heart disease issues and things like that. So it's really a serious issue that I didn't even realize in my 50s. And I'm much more concerned about it now. And so I think really what women in our 50s certainly need to be doing is getting that DEXA scan, which is a full body scan. You lay down, it's very simple, very easy. And you'll get this score of,
Right.
to see where you are in that spectrum. And I have a question about the T score, which is interesting, with compared to when with a bone density of the age of 30. So are we expected to keep that 30-year-old bone density till throughout our lifetime? And how likely is that?
That's a good question. I don't think that we're expected to keep it exactly, and that's why there is there's a buffer between going from, say, the average 30-year-old to an osteopenia diagnosis. You already have to have lost 10 to 12% of your bone mineral density.
Mm,
Right.
mhm.
So it's not until you get to -1 on the T score, which is about a 10 to 12% loss of bone mineral density, where you would develop osteopenia. And we know for sure that many people age and do not develop osteopenia.
Mhm.
So without a doubt, um, it's absolutely possible. We have to remember that when we are currently surveying a lot of populations, particularly Western populations, and looking at normal values and what's normal, unfortunately, we're looking at a lot of people that live a very sedentary lifestyle. And I believe we'll probably speak about exercise, but that's probably or arguably our greatest tool that we have against this, along with nutrition and with 50 or 60% of the average person's calories coming from ultra processed foods. Um, there's a lot of room for improvement on both of those things. So, and then you throw in alcohol and throw in smoking. Again, big risk factors for bone mineral density loss. And it's pretty apparent that when we are going out to a population and looking at the averages, um, you know, that's looking at the average bone mineral density in a population adopting the average Western lifestyle. And I'm not so sure that we should be targeting that average. I think we can actually do a lot better.
Mm. So we mentioned some of the risk factors as smoking and diet, exercise. I'm looking at age, and when we're talking about females, probably our
Mm.
hormones. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so I mean, menopause is clearly a risk factor in and of itself, particularly the drop in estrogen that occurs there. I'm not sure if you want to talk about hormone replacement therapy. I think it'd probably come up in this conversation. Um, but yeah, largely due to low estrogen and the ovary stopping production of estrogen. There's low body mass as well. If you're underweight, that can increase your risk simply by having less load going through the bones. Sedentary lifestyle, and specifically lack of resistance and weight bearing
Mhm.
exercise. Um, on the estrogen one, actually, and this is worth noting, this is something that tends to affect younger women, actually, because osteoporosis can actually occur in people that are in their 20s and 30s. And there is a syndrome, relative energy deficit deficiency syndrome, REDS, it's often referred to. And you this actually this syndrome is observed in males as well, but in females, it used to be called the female triad.
Mhm.
Um,
It's in sport, though, particularly, right? The
yeah,
S
so
for
it's
sport.
people that are doing a lot of training. Think of that very high performance young woman, um, but is undernourished, is not eating enough food and calories. Often they have huge performance goals, but they also have a lot of pressure to look a certain way, and
Yeah.
this can result in restriction and essentially, in short, many of these women lose their period. The body is doesn't have enough energy for basic physiological function, and says, "Well, we're not going to put energy into reproduction. We're just trying to stay alive here."
Mhm.
Um, and one of the downsides of that is a drop or decline in estrogen. They'll get a
Wow.
few changes in hormones and then bone mineral density loss. So you can actually see um, uh, osteoporosis at that stage of life as well. And I bring that up because that has a big knock-on effect that can then really affect that woman's risk of she might develop osteopenia at that stage of her life, but that's a stage of life where you really really want to be building strong bones and build up that reservoir and that sort of bank, so that if you lose a bit of bone later on, you don't go into this stage where you have very porous bone and are sort of easily experiencing fractures.
It's
um, and then on top of that, there are other conditions like hypothyroidism. There's anorexia, early onset menopause, and then some medications that could also increase the risk of bone mineral density loss, like certain steroids or chemotherapy, um, for example. So I think that's most of it. And then on the nutrition front, there's some specific nutrients. Obviously, calcium gets a lot of airtime, but it is a nutrient of focus for building strong bones. It's not the only one. It's a team game, building strong bones, but calcium, magnesium, vitamin D3, and protein are probably the sort of big four, I'd say.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like, this red S is accelerated aging, basically.
Right.
And I don't know, do you know Dr. Stacy Sims? She's quite
Yeah.
popular on that side of the world.
Yeah.
And she talks a lot about that, and it's under fueling and not, getting the nutrients that you need. And it's unfortunate that, yeah, this is women in sport
Mm.
needing to look a certain way. And then as these women hit menopause or perimenopause, it gets even worse, right? So it's really, when we're talking about, I just did a great podcast with Dr. Mindy Pels about fasting, and she's a fasting expert, but I'm really cautious on the fasting side, particularly for women in sport, athletic women, as we get into this stage, because many of them, I think it was about 40%, have um, eating disorders or some sort of disordered eating. And this kind of fasting can trigger, again, some issues once you you get into menopause. And it's seems to be spiraling out of control. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it starts in youth, and it sounded like it's pretty much accelerated aging, and you don't want to, you hopefully would take care of that when you're young, and you don't want to re-trigger that as you get into older age, and you are more at risk if you've had an episode before when you were younger. So it's really important that we try to take care of our health, and we nourish ourselves and nourish our body. It's what do we do when we hit our 50s, when our quote unquote metabolism is slowing down, as we think, we become more insulin resistant, and
Right.
we just exercise more and eat less, and then we get into that low energy availability state. And then to me, it sounds like it could be the same thing all over again, increasing our risk of osteoporosis by not getting the right nutrients and the right enough food in our bodies.
Mhm.
So, okay, so these were the one question I had recently, even in my community, is about osteoporosis. Is it reversible if if you get osteopenia and you're kind of seeing that DEXA score going the wrong way? Can you bring it back?
Yes, you can improve your bone mineral density. Now, it's going to depend where you are, and it's going to also require a combination of things. So, there will be changes in nutrition and attention to specific nutrients, like we just mentioned there. Um, a really good exercise program, and on paper, that is something that I think is quite clear. What does that look like? But practically, it depends who you're dealing with and what mobility restrictions do they have, um, in terms of being able to structure the exercise plan that they can actually perform and benefit from. And then, in addition to those two things, um, sometimes certain pharmaceutical drugs are also indicated, particularly if someone has osteoporosis. And there are different drugs, and really, weighing up the benefits and the risks is a conversation for someone to have with their physician. But there's different classes, Prolia, there's the oral bisphosphonate style drugs. Um, of course, there's hormone replacement therapy, um, that there is, I'd say, very good evidence improves bone mineral density or reduces bone mineral loss of bone mineral density over time. Not sure if you want to go into the kind of pros and cons and some of the media attention on hormone replacement therapy. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. I think our audience definitely wants to hear
but
what you have to say
um,
about that.
yeah, so, but I guess to answer your question in short, yes, you can improve your bone mineral density. Um, and the rate at which you can do that is going to depend on your own personal circumstances and, how much of a holistic plan you can kind of put into place. Um, and so with hormone replacement therapy, perhaps I'll touch on this and then we can zoom back out. I'm just conscious of giving people, I guess, something tangible they can walk away with here. But with hormone replacement therapy, there was, I guess, some fear that was generated off the back of a study, the Women's Health Initiative. And you'd be familiar with this. There was um, a study which looked at combination therapy. And this was in sort of peri or menopausal women. So it was a combination of estrogen therapy and progesterone. And it was a randomized controlled trial, so a sort of high quality study design. And they had placebo subjects, and then they had the subjects that were given the combination hormone replacement therapy. And they were looking at them over time and assessing different outcomes. So by different outcomes, they were looking at things like risk of developing diabetes or death from any cause or experiencing a fracture or developing cancer or any type of cardiovascular disease, or like deep vein thrombosis. All of these sorts of things they were monitoring over time. Um, and I guess, I mean, the interest into this obviously was that going through menopause, estrogen production declines. There's menopausal symptoms like vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, things like that. Um, and estrogen has been shown to help benefit that. But the interest was, well, long term, is this safe? Is giving women a bioidentical hormone, is that actually safe for them, or is it, somehow increasing risk of something else, and even if it's helping with symptoms, it's actually placing them at increased risk of something nasty? And we'd want to know that, right? So you could tell people. So that's the kind of purpose for this study. And that first trial, that combination therapy Women's Health Initiative trial, did find a slight increase in the risk of breast cancer. And I say slight, it was about a 6% relative risk increase compared to the placebo group. And also very, very slight increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And that's sort of where the media focused their attention on that study. What wasn't reported as much or didn't get as much airtime was that actually when you looked at all of the outcomes in that study, so you looked at total cancer incidence, it was actually lower in the group that was given hormone replacement therapy. When you look at fractures, they had 25% lower risk of developing a fracture in the hormone therapy group. And when you looked at death from all causes, they had a 10% reduction in risk of death from all causes, which is a really important one for us to consider. So, interesting study. Perhaps the results of that and the kind of nuance weren't sort of, I guess, communicated as well as they could have been, because it did turn a lot of people off hormone replacement therapy. And rightly so. If I heard that such something increased my risk of prostate cancer and I wasn't given any other information, well, I can see how that can influence someone. So I don't think it's an issue with the people reading the information. It's more the communication. Now, after that, Women's Health Initiative did another trial looking just at estrogen therapy. So first one was estrogen plus progesterone. Second trial was looking just at estrogen therapy. And so this time they saw across the board a 20 plus percent reduction in risk of diabetes, 11% reduction in risk of death from all causes. There was nearly a 20% reduction in risk of fractures, 8% risk reduction in total cancer. There was a risk reduction for breast cancer, for stroke, for coronary heart disease. This is in the group that was given hormone replacement therapy. I'll send you a link to a 2022 menopause guideline paper on this that came out just very recently that summarizes all of this. It's probably one of the best summaries. And so there was all these big risk reductions in the hormone replacement therapy. Now, there was slightly increased risk of pulmonary embolism and slightly increased risk of deep vein thrombosis. Very small, but they were there. And the guidelines they acknowledge that and say, with anything that we're putting in our body, there is a benefit versus risk ratio calculation that we have to consider. And so the current guidelines, so from that NAMS position statement that I just mentioned, they say that for women who are aged younger than 60 years of age or who are within 10 years of menopause onset, if they have no contraindications, right? And by contraindications, is usually we're talking about like a history of estrogen dependent cancer, or a family history of that. If they have no contraindications, the benefit to risk ratio is favorable in terms of taking or prescribing hormone replacement therapy for menopausal symptoms and for reducing bone loss.
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of the current position. There's a whole bunch of other studies that I haven't mentioned there that have also, since the WHI, confirmed those findings and shown reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease and bone mineral density loss with HRT. So all of that's in that guideline paper that I can share.
Mm, that would be wonderful to share that. There's in this space of women over 50 and menopausal women, there's a lot of talk about the Women's Health Initiative study. So I think that I'm so glad you brought that up. You explained it so well, and everyone can go and read this paper that you're going to share with us. And it is there's still so much information that we don't have, and there's the doctors themselves trying to give recommendations to women in menopause. There are very few, actually. There was a study done in the US, and I believe it was about 7% of the doctors felt capable of guiding a woman through menopause. And that's pretty low. Doctors don't seem to have enough training in menopause and hormone replacement therapy or alternatives. So we really still have a long way to go. I come from the generation where, yes, I thought hormones were bad. I'm scared because everything I heard causes cancer, that typical thing. And we really need to change this conversation around. And of course, we still need more research, but I think we need to have more doctors, obviously trained in menopause, especially as the population is aging.
Right.
There's just going to have all these women who, if not already, who are going through menopause. So they've already passed. Many of them already passed, and I think there was a lost opportunity there. But I'm really glad you brought that up. You explained it so well. HRT is, you have to obviously talk to your doctor about that to see if you're a good candidate and make that decision for yourself. And again, it's the risks and benefits, and where do you fall in that spectrum? So, okay.
Just to
Um,
add one
yeah.
thing on to while I remember, there's a book called Estrogen Matters. I'm not sure if you've seen it.
Yes.
It's by
Yes.
Carol Tavris, and she wrote it with an MD. I forget his name, but that's also worth reading if someone's thinking, look, I'm just a bit confused about hormone replacement therapy and estrogen and just wants a bit more information. I recommend checking that out.
Thank you so much for bringing that book up. I would love to get these two on the podcast. That's a goal I would love to have. And I think it's one of those books, yeah, we all need to look into. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. So, one last question about osteoporosis that also came up was in terms of exercise, since you're if could
Mhm.
get your physiotherapy hat on. Dr. Stacy Sims mentions studies on plyometrics as being
Mhm.
better than strength training, because we all have been hearing strength training, lift heavy weights, to increase our lower risk of osteoporosis. So plyometrics, have you come across any of that as being superior, or does it depend on the
Yeah,
person?
I think she's right, but I'm a big believer in a multimodal exercise program that covers all of it for different reasons. Um, I think we need the strength training component for reducing muscle tissue loss and maintaining the integrity of muscle, like the architecture of muscle as we age, which is just as important as how much we have. And it's not just contributing to our strength; it's a metabolic organ, and helps us maintain blood glucose levels and whatnot. So I think she's right in terms of, I mean, if you look at the osteoporosis and bone mineral density and sort of training guidelines and evidence, certainly any sort of impact style exercise is much better than sort of low impact or no impact exercise. For example, take someone who sits on a bike all day, and their bone mineral density in their spine is terrible, and upper body.
Mm.
Absolutely terrible. Look at a swimmer, someone who just swims all the time, same thing. They are very prone to developing low bone mineral density. Now, I'm not saying cycling and swimming are not great exercises. You can get an incredible cardiovascular workout on them. This is where I'm talking about multimodal. So I'm kind of careful on sort of saying, this is better than that, so just do that, because they all target different systems. And so when I look at exercise, I think, okay, you know, I'm thinking about protecting muscle. I'm thinking about protecting metabolic health. I'm thinking about protecting bone health, which arguably falls under metabolic health. I'm thinking about slowing down or preventing neurodegenerative processes in the brain. And there are different types of exercises that affect each of these sort of systems in the body differently. But in short, to load the bones, I think anything where you're either sort of weight bearing and carrying a load, it could be resistance training in a machine, or it could be doing squats or step ups or skipping. There's plenty of stuff you can do without going to the gym. Absolutely. And from a kind of strength training point of view, and I'm not sure if Stacey spoke about this, but this is really interesting actually. So if you want to build muscle, it really doesn't matter if you do 8 reps or 30, as long as those last 2 or 3 reps are approaching fatigue, a sort of technical point of failure. It doesn't
Mm.
matter. So you can imagine you could choose a slightly heavier weight that you could only lift for 8 reps. And at rep 8, you've only got another couple that you could possibly do, right? You've
Mhm.
left 2 reps in reserve. That's what we would say. Or you could choose a lighter weight. Now you can do more reps because it's lighter, and you can go all the way up to 30. But again, once you get to 30, you only have 2 reps in reserve. Okay. So we know for building muscle, it doesn't matter if you choose a sort of lowish rep range at about 8 or 30. And this research got spread a lot during COVID because a lot of the bodybuilders got stuck at home with no weights. They had very small weights. They were very happy to realize that, well, actually, I've only got a light weight, but I can do 30 reps. And as long as I'm getting to that point of failure, I can still build muscle. Now, here's the downside. Resistance training doesn't just affect muscle, it affects bone because your tendons are pulling on bone. So it's a different type of loading. And this is also, we need to learn a lot more about this. But we assess bone mineral density, and I mentioned back at the start the T score. But bone architecture and quality is also, we're really starting to learn that this is equally as important. And it might be that we need to load the bone in different ways. So some of it is that more mechanical loading through jumping or stepping with weights, and others is loading where we're really getting the tendon, the muscles are contracting, and you're getting the tendon pulling on the bone. Okay,
Mm.
so it's a slightly different type of stimulus that the bone has to respond to, because that's what we're doing here when we're loading the bone through any of this exercise. We're basically sending a signal to that bone tissue, hey, you need to grow stronger,
Mm.
because we're increasing the demand here. Now, that's what the body does. I learned this in my undergrad. Structure reflects function. So unless you demand more of the body, it won't adapt. It's lazy. Doesn't need to. It's not going to expend energy on doing something that it doesn't need to. it's only going to spend energy and lay down more bone because it's anticipating that you're going to throw more of this task at it. Okay,
Mm.
and that's why the progressive overload, always trying to challenge the body, is really important. But back to my point about the rep range, that it's been shown in studies that the lower the rep, so at that 8 rep, that's going to be better for bone mineral density than a light load that you're doing for 30. And it's likely just because you're holding, or you're lifting a greater load that's placing a lot more force through the bone during that set that you're doing. So all in all, I think plyometric or any sort of weight bearing, sort of jogging, skipping, um, and doing squats that are loaded. You can walk with ankle cuffs. I've done a lot of this with, as I said, mentioned before, you need to be creative in how you're constructing these exercise programs depending on where someone's at. You can do squats at home and get a weighted vest, so you can buy vests online that you can put weights in. And then, when you're doing your resistance style training, trying to find a weight where you're doing that 8 to 12 reps, and when you get to the 12 reps, you really feel like you only have 2 reps in reserve, and getting to that point is going to be what sends that signal to your body to actually adapt and grow stronger.
Mm. This is amazing. I didn't realize, yeah, that you could go into the 30 rep or lighter weight in order to really create those adaptations. So that makes me think, I mean, that's, and we're talking about building muscle. So this is the sarcopenia element that we'll talk about later, but not necessarily for the osteoporosis, right? Is that what you're saying, is we still need to lift something quite heavy, get that load to
Right.
avoid
This is why
osteoporosis?
for anyone, in their 50s or 60s, that's really just thinking about healthy aging. I'm, where possible, I'm getting them to think about doing sets where the rep range is in that 8 to 12, rather than doing a light load and doing 30. Yes, the research shows that can be beneficial for building muscle, but I want them to think of the exercise as both a stimulus for muscle and bone, and therefore choose a weight where 8 to 12 reps is challenging. And to know if it's challenging, you just come back to that principle. Could I keep going and do many more reps here, more than 2? If you can, then that weight is it's too light for you. So then you have options. Your options are to increase that the load is the that would be the preferred option in that scenario, so that you can stay in that 8 to 12 rep range. You're loading bone tissue at a point where it's going to adapt, and then you're also going to get the hypertrophy, the increase in muscle benefits as well. And just to kind of, I guess, tie a knot in that, like over a week, I often get asked, like, what does this look like as a program overall? Um, you know, 2 to 3 sessions a week, I think, of kind of resistance strength training is would be the goal. And again, you don't have to go to the gym. You can go to the gym, but you can do this stuff at home. You can get creative. You want, within each of those sessions, and there's some really good guidelines for older adults, resistance training, sort of conditioning guidelines that I can send you. But so 2 to 3 times a week, and when you're in that session, what does a session look like? Well, that's going to be 2 or 3 sets, right, of 1 to 2 exercises for each major muscle group.
Hmm. So how
Okay,
long?
so
Go, yeah,
it'll
maybe
take
explain, yeah.
that might take about 45 minutes or so.
Mhm.
Um, and you would have about 2 minutes rest between a set, right? So
Mhm.
what is a set? What could this actually look like if we break this down a little bit further? Um, it could look like a set doing squats, so body weight squats, which is really going to work your quads, so the muscles on the front of your thighs, and also your glutes. Um, Again, targeting that 8 to 12 sort of rep range, and you do 2 or 3 sets of that, choosing a load where you feel fatigued at that 8 to 12 rep range and you only have a couple of more reps in reserve. Um, so that might be one exercise that you choose to do. Now, the next could be a step up. So if you have a step that at the gym they have these, but you might be able to find something at home that is sort of the height of 2 steps that you can step up to, and you can do it without weights. If again, 10 to 12 of those gets you really fatigued, or if it's not, then you'll need to hold some weights. Okay. Now you've just done 2 exercises for your lower body. Okay. Then you can move to doing a couple of exercises for upper body. And if you're at home, things that can help with this are getting some weights that you could pick up, or bands. Elastic bands can also work. Again, you're just coming back to the principle of making sure that it's when you're getting to that 8 to 12 rep range, you only have a couple left and you're feeling quite fatigued.
Hmm.
um, yeah.
So yeah, no, this is really useful, because I think when you break it down, people can visualize and see and hear basically, what those exercises could be. But I'm thinking about, when we're thinking in our 50s and 60s, there's a certain amount of muscle mass we generally have, and then as we get into our 70s and 80s, I'm wondering if these exercises may look a lot different. And so when I'm really considering, I was introduced to um, BFR bands, blood flow restriction bands, and through Dr. Chris Gaviglio. And I thought, he's also in Australia. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting concept, even though there's a lot of bodybuilders using it. But in terms of rehab, and maybe some older adults who just can't lift a heavy weight or don't have a personal trainer, I'm wondering, would it sounded like this would, be a wonderful option for them, obviously with if they don't have any contraindications and heart issues. But what are your thoughts on that as being an alternative to lifting heavy weights to build not build muscle mass, but I'm not sure about the bone
Yeah,
density.
it's an area of research that I'm not an expert in blood flow restriction, but I have read with great sort of curiosity various studies looking at it, and um, I think that from a hypertrophy point of view, it mechanistically it makes sense, and I absolutely agree that lighter loads are often they're certainly better for someone who lacks confidence, or even people that have a bit of a niggle or an injury. So there are some reasons like where often if I was working with someone, I would select lighter loads, particularly if it's the first time they're doing a movement and you're just trying to get that movement pattern down. Um, so I guess I should caveat what I'm saying about the kind of 10 to 12 rep range. And mind you, that's not extremely, I'm not talking about crazy loads. Crazy loads would be if we were asking people to do 3 reps,
Mm.
choosing a huge weight and doing a 3 rep kind of max or 1 rep. Um, but yeah, blood flow restriction I'd love to see more studies looking at it in elderly cohorts. As I mentioned at the beginning, hopefully there's more and more research in this area, also looking at things like nutrition. But of the research that we do have, um, there are studies that are getting people in their 60s and 70s and 80s doing exercise programs where they do 2 or 3 um, sort of 40-minute workouts a week. And similar to what I'm talking about now. So, body weight squats and step ups and some kind of hip hinge, like deadlift style movements, and usually a bias for lower body. And I should say that if you were going to do sort of 3 sessions a week, then you would want more of your exercises to be lower body than upper body if we're talking about healthy aging, just because of the importance of lower body strength for getting up, down off the floor, for stabilizing, for preventing falls. Um, so that would be where my kind of bias is, particularly if someone was time poor. But back to these studies, you're putting people through, and some studies they put people through are 90 years old, and
Mhm.
you can get huge increases in muscle tissue by getting these people to do resistance training, and that these aren't people going to the gym and doing crazy exercises. It's at home stuff. So all of this is absolutely achievable, and I would go as far as to say when it comes to healthy aging, nutrition certainly gets a lot of airtime. Something I'm very passionate about and talk a lot about, but exercise is arguably top of the list.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, they do go hand in hand too, right? In
Certainly.
terms of they're both so important. And it's really hard to talk about one without the other because when we're talking, let's move a little bit into the sarcopenia,
Mhm.
because if you're building muscle mass, right, you need to with your exercise, you also need to feed that as
Mhm.
well. And we did talk about, just to wrap up a little bit about the osteoporosis in terms of nutrition. You mentioned the vitamin D, you mentioned getting the calcium, you mentioned getting the protein as well. So, that in terms of your nutrition, we talked about HRT. Being a possibility as well. You need to talk to your doctor about it. And then, of course, we really dove into the exercise. And I love the fact that you are very well rounded in that sense. There's so many benefits to having a well rounded exercise program to help with the osteoporosis. And so let's move on to the sarcopenia, which is age related muscle mass loss.
Right.
What and its concern, especially women notice a lot as we go through menopause. So, is one question I have is maybe first to talk a little bit what you know about sarcopenia, and is sarcopenia exclusively age related?
Mhm. Can I just add a couple of bullet points on the nutrition front that I didn't cover? And I just want
Yeah.
to make sure that people have got these. So we mentioned calcium and magnesium and whatnot. Vitamin K2 is another one just to be aware of. There are quite a few trials looking at postmenopausal women who had osteopenia, and they had a placebo group and a group taking 180 micrograms of vitamin K2
Mm.
in a form called MK7. Right, there's MK4 and MK7. They're different. MK7 is what you want to look for. They had significantly improved bone mineral density in the group that was given vitamin K2, and that's been reproduced in multiple studies now, which is something that we're always looking for. Um, and so you could look that up. Um, the other, an easy one, a food one, is dried prunes. Not sure if you've
Wow.
ever come across this, but
No.
again, quite a few studies. There's got to be 5 or 6 studies now that are, and some of these are 12 months long, which is really long for a sort of food-based intervention. Looking at something like dried prunes, but they looked at in these studies postmenopausal women, a group that were a control group, and then a group given 50 grams of dried prunes, which I think
Wow.
is about
It's a lot of sugar.
it's about 5 or 6 prunes, yeah. So there's
Yeah.
a bit of sugar in there, but I think if someone's overall health is in good check and they're exercising, this can be something that they could probably add in. Um, and they had significantly less bone mineral density loss compared to the controls, and then again, this has been reproduced in several studies.
Hmm.
Um, so
Interesting.
dried
I'm gonna,
prunes,
yeah, add those
yeah,
prunes.
yeah, so you'll see, like a lot of kind of rheumatologists and endocrinologists will often recommend dried prunes. And then the last one, and I know I'm diverging from your question, I'm going to come back to sarcopenia, is a probiotic. And I really don't recommend a lot of probiotics. I think we're learning a lot about them very quickly, and hopefully we have much better information to be very specific. This is one case where there is at least one high quality randomized controlled trial that I think is worth looking at if someone was struggling with their bone mineral density. They had a probiotic called Lactobacillus reuteri,
Mhm.
um, and there's a number after that, 6475, which sort of signifies the bacteria. And that probiotic was shown in that trial to significantly protect against bone loss again in postmenopausal women. So
Hmm.
they're not 100% sure of the kind of mechanism there as to how that's doing, but again, something just for someone to consider in their overall plan if they're looking for a bit of extra help there.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
okay, sarcopenia.
Wow, those are great. Sorry, those are great tips that I've never heard of. And I'm going to keep these in the show notes because people will go, lacto what? Which
Right.
675? What was that? So please don't worry. I will get this in the notes. And the prunes as well. I'm going to have to dump that into, I made one of your recipes, the pumpkin oat chia waiting for me right after this interview, and I'll have to dump some prunes in there. um, so yes, exactly. So thank you so much. And one question about the K2 though. So very often D3 comes with a K2.
Mhm.
So would we have to really pay attention to make sure that it's the M7
Yeah,
form, I think that you've mentioned?
MK7. Yeah, yeah, I think so. And the reason for that is that, well, MK7 is the form that has been shown to prevent bone loss, firstly, but the bioavailability of MK4 and MK7 is very different.
Mm.
So MK7 is much more bioavailable. MK7 is found in a food called natto,
Oh, yes.
out of Japan, which many people find to taste, um, it's an acquired taste. Most people don't think it tastes like feet. Uh, so
It looks
it
like
might not
boogers.
it might not be on the menu for too many of your listeners, but you can get the supplement MK7. Um, MK4 is found in some food. It's found in eggs and yogurt, a few other foods, but the bioavailability is very, very low. And then often people will say, well, how does our body actually get enough K2? And um, in most of us, our microbiome manufactures K2. That's why it's actually not considered an essential
Mm.
um, vitamin. But with the research on postmenopausal women showing benefit, there is a bit of an emerging school of thought that maybe not all of us are equally as good at producing vitamin K2. And so
Mhm.
we need further research to kind of better understand, why is there benefit with supplementing this in this population group? I would say at this stage, there's definitely not an indication for everyone to just go out and supplement vitamin K2. There's not enough evidence to kind of warrant that. But if you are someone with that's lost had some bone loss and you're postmenopausal, it might be a good idea.
Mm. Okay, thank you so much for clearing that. And by any chance, do you have anywhere on your site where you talk about the supplements and recommended brands or anything like that that would have in general?
I have a free guide where I do talk about various supplements and kind of just recommend a bunch of different brands that I was able to find around the world online. I'm not sure whether I had vitamin K2 in there. I can check. I'll give you a link to that,
Mhm.
and a link to all of these studies as well and that probiotic.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, we're running out of time now, and we did cover some parts of sarcopenia, but let's move on a little bit more to that and
Okay.
give us some of your thoughts.
Right. Okay. So, I guess high level sarcopenia, most of us would think of it as muscle loss, but it is a little bit more than that. So, the European Working Group are a group that sort of classified sarcopenia a few years back into three groups, and there is sort of pre-sarcopenia. So again, similar to osteoporosis and diabetes, there's a spectrum. Pre-sarcopenia is when you just lose muscle. So you asked, is it just aging, or can this happen to anyone? Typically we see it in aging because people become more sedentary. There's an argument right now in science, a debate as to how much of it is actual biologically wired, hardwired in us versus a result of our lifestyle. But we do know, for example, if you immobilize someone who's not old, who's young, they will get a huge amount of muscle loss. So
Mhm.
you can get muscle loss, early in life if you're not moving your body, which is, I think, is a big clue that at least the rate at which we lose muscle is going to be dependent on how much we're moving our body.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
so
I agree.
pre-sarcopenia is just loss of muscle. Sarcopenia itself, truly as defined as sarcopenia, is a loss of muscle and strength. So it
Mm,
has to be combined with a loss of strength. And then there's severe sarcopenia, which is the third group. That's when you lose muscle size, you lose strength, and you lose performance or function. So someone's ability to get up off the floor, for example, or get in and out of the bath or get in and out of the car, because they just don't have the power. And power is an important word here, because just to add another layer of complexity here, when we age, and this does seem to be driven by the aging process, but again, can be modified through exercise, specific exercise, we get a change in muscle fiber type. So there are different muscle fiber types: fast twitch and slow twitch. And fast and slow speaks to the rate at which they fatigue. So
mhm,
fast twitch means fast fatiguing. So you can get a lot of power, a lot of burst, right? They're going to be those things that we're going to use when we just need to create a lot of power quickly. And then slow twitch, slow to fatigue, is why they're named that. They're going to be more something we call on for endurance.
mm,
Um, and what we see with sarcopenia is actually the muscle tissue architecture changes, and you get these fast twitch fibers turning into slow twitch, and you actually
mm,
lose the sort of size of the fast twitch fibers, which means you lose this capacity to sort of produce power quickly.
mm,
And the third, and then there are more, but the third element of what happens within muscle tissue as someone develops sarcopenia, and this really ties into metabolic health, is we start to get fat building up. So fatty tissue building up in the muscle. It shouldn't be there. We call that ectopic fat. So when you're not using the muscle and you're losing size, you're getting this change in muscle type fiber, which is affecting function, and you get a buildup of fat tissue, which usually coincides with a buildup of fat in other organs. Muscle's just an organ, a buildup of fat around the liver, for example. And the downstream knock-on effect of this, and this is why I want people to think about muscle a little bit differently than just brute strength and thinking about the gym and bodybuilding, is a, a a poor ability to regulate your blood glucose.
mm,
And this is really important. So there's an analogy I often use here. I get people to think about a bathtub, and the tap of that bath is your liver. Okay.
mhm,
And one of the important roles of the liver is to produce glucose. And it produces glucose overnight. So think about it. We're in a fasted state. We're not eating any food, but our body needs to maintain glucose in the blood at a certain level to prevent us from dying. So what happens is the liver will produce that glucose, and it sort of pours it out into the bloodstream. Okay. So in our analogy, we've got a bath with a tap. The tap is the liver. So imagine we're turning that on, and that now the water's flowing into the bath. That water is our glucose. Okay. And the bath's filling up. That bath is that's our bloodstream. And at the bottom of the bath, you have a drain. Okay. So that drain is your muscle tissue.
mhm,
Your muscle tissue is the biggest site in our body for glucose disposal. What does that mean? Well, it acts like a sponge. It sucks up glucose, right? So you have this beautiful system between your liver and your muscle, which together help balance your blood glucose or balance your blood sugar, right? And so this can go awry or go wrong if either the tap, the liver, can't be turned off, or the drain's blocked.
mm,
What happens when you develop fat? So when people talk about fatty liver, or as I just mentioned there with sarcopenia, you get fat in the muscle. we impair our ability to turn off the tap, to turn off the liver. So the liver is producing more glucose. It can't turn off. And that's because you get what's called insulin resistance at the side of the liver. Now, if we think about the muscle tissue, with the fat that's being built up by lack of resistance training, changes in the muscle tissue architecture, that muscle tissue is now no longer as good of a sponge to soak up the water, or in this case, to soak up the glucose. Okay. What happens to that bath is that water is just filling up and up because the tap's on and it can't drain out, and it's going to start overflowing. And that is synonymous with your blood glucose rising, which places us at increased risk of cardiovascular disease, a number of other things. Um, so all of that is, I guess, to say that when you're thinking about muscle tissue, sarcopenia is affecting function. It's affecting our independence, quality of life. It affects our risk of falls, which flows onto our risk of fracture, which we've already covered. It affects our metabolic health. And we probably don't have time to explore this, but it's also an endocrine organ of sorts. And there's a ton of emerging research showing that when we exercise, particularly when we do resistance training, we get production in these molecules called myokines. And I had a fellow on my show recently, Paul Taylor, and we spoke about this at length. There's a great review that I'll give you that these myokine molecules that are produced from our muscle tissue, they have effects throughout the body. But one of the biggest organs where they're believed to be having an effect, and the mechanisms are not fully understood, is many of these myokines actually flow into the blood and cross the blood-brain barrier.
Mm.
And so there are a number of precursors to brain-derived neurotrophic factor and other sort of growth factors in the brain, proteins that act to protect the brain. So they're anti-inflammatory, lower inflammation. They also act as somewhat like a fertilizer to help with neuroplasticity and the connection of new or new neural connections. And so there's now a lot of research looking at resistance training and the maintenance of muscle tissue and avoiding sarcopenia, and how that could be protecting us from neurodegenerative diseases. So when we're thinking about lifting weights, we really need to be thinking about it in a much more holistic way than doing it, I guess, for the more aesthetic reasons of how do our biceps look in the mirror.
Yes, absolutely. What a great synopsis. And I do notice in my community, as we age, we are much more concerned about all of those things. When we were in our 40s, not so much, just wanted to look good in a bikini. And as the research comes out and the chatter comes, or we look at our parents who are aging, we see them falling, or we see them, Alzheimer's or dementia and other issues that concern us. So definitely, we are more concerned about those. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because exercise just hits so many marks, and getting that well-rounded program is super important. But let's talk briefly. We only have just maybe a couple minutes left in terms of fueling the muscle growth, because protein is a big one on the front here. But when I went through my gerontology program, Dr. Walter Longo, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him and his research. He's was one of my professors, and he talked a lot about high protein diets and how that's a risk of tumors and cancers. Scared us all. We were all protein phobes, but yet I've questioned, well, are we just going to be frail? And and he does mention after the age of 65 we do need to increase it, but until I get there, I still don't want to put myself at risk of sarcopenia and osteoporosis. So what are your thoughts on protein for a woman around 50, 60, 70s, 80s?
Mhm. I feel like I'm perfectly placed to answer this. I've got Volta back on the show in about 45 minutes, actually. So,
Oh.
um, I had I had him on a couple of weeks ago. I had him on 3 years ago. And then very recently, I've sat down with Don Lehman, Stuart Phillips, Professor Christopher Gardner, all to talk about this very topic because there are so many different views out there. And you have the
Yes.
anti-aging community, and then you have the sarcopenia community, and they do tend to come to different conclusions. And one of the questions I was interested in is sort of what you just alluded to: is this a case of, if we prioritize our lifespan, does that come at the expense of how independent we are, and are we going to be more frail? And is that going to negatively affect our quality of life, but we live longer? And if we prioritize our, strength and muscle mass, does that come at the expense of how long we live? Right.
Tell
And
me.
okay, I'm not sure we know. Is the short answer. I can tell you where I've landed by having all of these different conversations. With like, these are clearly Volta Longo and these other guys. They're the real experts in this space, looking at protein metabolism and different um, pathways, longevity pathways, and so Bolter's paper that he brought out with Morgan Levine, the paper that you mentioned there, that did show an association between high IGF-1, higher protein intake, and cancer and total mortality, I believe, in people that were under the age of 65. That risk was attenuated the more plant protein that you consumed and the less animal protein. So there was a sub-analysis that looked at that, which is one of the reasons why Volter is a proponent for, consuming sort of plant predominant style dietary patterns. Um, and then in the over 65, as you say, the relationship changed. So then there was, those that were having more protein actually had lower risk of cancer and lower risk of total mortality. Then on top of that, Volter also talks about animal studies. So in animal studies, they've done protein restriction. So you restrict protein or certain amino acids. There's both studies looking at total protein and different amino acids like methionine in rats, and look at comparing them to a control, what happens to their lifespan. And there are studies that have shown that protein restriction in these animal models increases lifespan. But the problem with these studies is those rats, they live longer, but they're also in a cage. They're not exposed to an environment where they're going to potentially be destabilized and have a fall. And so it's hard to extrapolate that to a human being, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sort of get a feel for what was their quality of life like in those
Yeah.
studies. In my conversation with Volta, I asked him what he thought was like a healthy IGF-1 level. And I forget the unit of measurement, but it's about 130 to 150, whatever the unit of measurement was. I'll give you that. But he seemed to think that this is a good biomarker, and that one could go away and could get that tested. And if you were consuming, higher protein diet, but your IGF-1 level was within that range, then you probably have nothing to worry about
Hmm.
at all. Where do I personally land on all of this? I feel like the research is pretty clear that a slightly higher protein intake is more optimal than the RDA. But I don't think that we need to go crazy on it. And I think that we have to remember the most important thing is the actual stimulus, the resistance training, by far.
Hmm.
Without that, it doesn't matter how much protein you consume. So
Yes.
if we were thinking, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilo. I think there's reasonable evidence to suggest that 1.2, maybe 1.3 grams per kilogram is more optimal for maintaining muscle mass, preserving muscle tissue as we age. Now, there are other studies showing that up north of 1.6 grams per kilogram is optimal if your goal is just to put on as much muscle mass as possible. And so you'll see, athletes will quote that number, or bodybuilders and whatnot. I don't think we have the evidence to say that the average person who's interested in healthy aging would want to target that. And if anything, I would err on the side of caution, because I think that, Volta's research, it's hard to completely discard it. It's not perfect, and there are some gaps that need to be filled in, but there are multiple lines of evidence that do suggest it's probably not a good thing to have a very high IGF-1 level. And you look at the South American population that has a genetic mutation where they have low IGF-1, they have a very low risk of cancer, and they live a pretty long life without a lot of chronic disease.
Despite
Um,
having a pretty bad lifestyle, if I remember
right,
what their
right,
lifestyle was
right.
not
So
very
there, I think
healthy.
I think there is something in that. And so my approach is, let's prioritize resistance training, and let's do that really well. So again, like I was saying before, 2 or 3 sessions a week, 45 minutes in those sessions, making sure you're progressively overloading. So you're constantly, and by that I mean you're increasing the load, I think in most cases here, um, over time, to get your body to respond. That's going to be the most important factor here, and being very consistent with that.
Yeah.
And then from a protein point of view, I don't think we have to go absolutely crazy on protein intake. I think about 1.2 grams per kilogram, based on the research that we have today, would seem like a good target. And then having a bias for plant protein over animal protein, to what extent that can be down to the individual, depending on the types of foods that they want to eat. But that that seems to have a benefit from an IGF-1 point of view, from a cancer risk point of view. And certainly if we were to zoom out and look at other aspects of cardiometabolic health, and look at conditions like dementia, there does seem to be fairly consistent benefits to eating more plant protein and de-emphasizing the animal protein compared to a standard diet. So those would kind of be my sort of main tips, basing that protein around plant protein, or from animal protein. If someone was going to consume animal foods, fatty fish would be preferable over, say, red meat, for example.
Mhm. I'm so glad you mentioned that the exercise is so much more important than the protein intake in that sense, because I can see people thinking, okay, I'm just going to eat the protein and not exercise because that's the easy way out. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And it sounds really, there's a balance in everything. And there's a balance to your exercise and the program, how much protein you eat, what you eat, and I'm really, really grateful for your time. I'm so aware you have got to go. You have got another. Say hi to Vulture for me,
I will.
and I would love to share a little bit more about your contacts. You're on Facebook, your Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Your website is theproof.com, where you can find links to all of that. I'll have links in the show notes. Your book is as well on your website, theproof.com. Are there any last words that you would like to have for a woman in her 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s before we go?
I think we covered some great territory. This can sound very confusing, and it can sound like, um, there's a lot of things that you need to do. I would say just go slow. Getting all of the information is great, and maybe making a bit of a list as to the things that you'd like to change or think that you could improve. Um, but you don't have to make all these changes overnight. And to be fair, um, even if you sort of implemented 70-80% of the things we're talking about here, what's great about this conversation is these are the big levers. We're not talking about all the peripheral things, that the shiny objects that we might see on social media that get our attention, but they really don't make a huge difference. The nutrition and the exercise, they're the big levers. And if you pay some attention to them, and just get them right most of the time, you don't have to do it perfectly. You're going to really change the outlook of your health as you move into your 50s, 60s, 70s, and hopefully beyond. But going about making these changes, go slow. create a priority list, work through them, add things in slowly, gently. Most of us are much better at building habits when we do that, as opposed to walking away from this podcast and thinking that you're going to completely flip your lifestyle upside down.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Simon. I am going to direct everyone to you. You've got to listen to your podcast and your beautiful voice, and we'll learn so much at the same time. So thank you and have a good day, good night, good morning, wherever you guys are.